Close your eyes and picture this. The year is not 2000. Not even 2000 BCE, but more than 12,000 years ago. You're standing on a barren plain, clutching a spear tipped with sharpened stone. Across from you is not an animal, but another human, fighting for the same river, the same food, the same chance to live. This moment is where war begins. War, in its most primal form, is as old as humanity. For most of prehistory, humans lived as hunter-gatherers, moving in small tribes, competing with nature more than each other. But archaeology tells us something unsettling. Even then, humans fought one another. At Jebel Sahaba in Sudan, a mass grave dating back to around 10,000 BCE was uncovered. Inside lay over 60 skeletons, many pierced with flint-tipped arrows and spearheads. Some bodies even had multiple wounds, suggesting they had been attacked by volleys of arrows. This was not random murder. This was organized killing. It may have been the world's first battle or massacre. As the Neolithic Revolution began, humans settled into farming communities. Villages grew, and with them came something new: ownership of land. Suddenly, water sources, fertile soil, and stored crops had to be defended. Unlike nomads who could move away, farmers had something permanent to lose, and that meant they had something worth fighting for. At Jericho, one of the world's earliest cities, archaeologists discovered massive stone walls and a tower. Dating back to around 9000 BCE, these were not built to keep out wild animals. They were defenses, a sign that even in humanity's earliest cities, war was a real threat. By the 3rd millennium BCE, warfare had evolved into something far more structured in Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization. City-states like Lagos and Umma were constantly at war over farmland and canals. One of the most fascinating records of early war is the Stele of the Vultures around 2450 BCE. This carved monument shows soldiers of Lagos in tight formations, wearing helmets, advancing with spears and shields. On the other side, their enemies lie dead, picked apart by vultures. It's one of the earliest depictions of organized armies in history. War wasn't just about survival anymore. It had become politics. Around 2300 BCE, Sargon of Akkad created one of the world's first empires. His success came not only from ambition but from a new idea: a professional standing army. Instead of seasonal fighters, Sargon kept soldiers ready year-round, supplied and trained for conquest. His empire stretched across Mesopotamia, and for the first time in history, war was being used not just to defend, but to expand. The Egyptians, too, were building their military legacy. The most famous early battle was the Battle of Megiddo in 1479 BCE, led by Pharaoh Thutmose III. Facing a coalition of Canaanite kings, Thutmose chose a risky path, a narrow mountain route that left his army vulnerable. His advisors warned against it, but he pressed on. The gamble paid off. The Egyptians caught their enemies off guard, crushed them, and established dominance over the Levant. Egyptian scribes recorded the battle in incredible detail, making Megiddo the first recorded battle in history. But no ancient power struck fear quite like the Assyrians. Rising to dominance by the 9th century BCE, the Assyrians mastered siege warfare. They used iron weapons, battering rams, and siege towers to storm fortified cities. Yet their most terrifying weapon was not their machines, but their psychological warfare. Assyrian kings boasted in inscriptions about flaying rebels alive, impaling enemies on stakes, and displaying severed heads. Whole populations were deported to prevent uprisings. They didn't just fight wars. They used terror to maintain an empire. Elsewhere, warfare was shaping entire cultures. In Greece, the legendary Trojan War became immortalized in Homer's Iliad, whether myth or reality. Archaeology at Troy shows that violent conflict did occur around 1200 BCE, possibly between Mycenaean Greeks and Anatolian peoples. For the Greeks, war was not just survival, it was destiny, glory, and storytelling. In China, the Shang dynasty 1610-46 BCE developed bronze weapons, war chariots, and large armies. Warfare was deeply tied to the rise and fall of dynasties, a cycle that would continue for centuries. The biggest revolution in ancient warfare, however, came from the horse and chariot. Around 2000 BCE, nomadic steppe peoples learned to harness the horse for war. Chariots gave armies speed, power, and shock value. Egyptian, Hittite, and later Persian armies relied on them heavily. The most famous clash of chariot armies was the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BCE between Ramses II of Egypt and the Hittites. With over 5,000 chariots, it remains one of the largest chariot battles ever fought. Although the battle ended indecisively, it led to something extraordinary. The world's first known peace treaty, signed between Egypt and the Hittites. By 1000 BCE, a new technology reshaped the battlefield. Iron weapons, unlike bronze, iron was plentiful and stronger. Armies could now arm thousands of soldiers cheaply, leading to larger and more devastating wars. Spears, swords, and armor became more widespread, and battles grew bloodier. What began as small tribal clashes had now become wars of empire, religion, and ambition. Humans had discovered not only how to kill but how to organize killing on a massive scale. War was now a tool to build kingdoms, spread religions, and write history itself. But the story doesn't end here. From these early skirmishes would rise mighty civilizations, the Egyptians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans. Their wars would not only redraw maps but inspire legends, reshape cultures, and set the stage for the world's greatest empires. The next chapter is where war becomes civilization's driving force. Imagine a world where kings command thousands of soldiers armed with bronze swords, where mighty empires rise and fall with every battle, and where victory on the battlefield means the difference between eternal glory or complete destruction. This was the age of ancient civilizations at war, where legends were born, and the foundations of military history were laid. By the second millennium BCE, warfare had evolved far beyond tribal skirmishes. Empires were rising, and with them came larger, more organized armies, stronger weapons, and strategies that would influence the course of history. Egypt, pharaohs of war. The Egyptians were among the earliest masters of organized warfare. Their armies combined archers, spearmen, and the revolutionary weapon of the time, the chariot. Egyptian chariots were light, fast, and deadly, often carrying 2 men, a driver and an archer who could rain arrows while moving at high speed. One of the most famous Egyptian military leaders was Thutmose III. In 1479 BCE, he led his forces into the legendary Battle of Megiddo, the first battle in recorded history with detailed accounts. His opponents, a coalition of Canaanite kings, blocked the main roads. Instead of taking the obvious routes, Thutmose took a bold gamble, leading his army through a dangerous narrow mountain pass. The move shocked his enemies. Egypt won the battle and secured dominance in the Levant for nearly 200 years. Later, in 1274 BCE, Pharaoh Ramses II clashed with the Hittites at the Battle of Kadesh, one of the largest chariot battles ever fought, with thousands of soldiers and over 5,000 chariots. The battle was chaotic and brutal. Ramses narrowly avoided defeat, and though the war ended in a stalemate, it resulted in something unprecedented. The world's first known peace treaty, a diplomatic solution forged out of endless bloodshed. The Persian Empire, masters of conquest. As Egypt's power faded, new empires rose. Among the greatest was the Persian Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE. Cyrus revolutionized warfare by combining military might with political strategy. He built an empire that stretched from the Indus Valley to the Mediterranean, conquering with speed but ruling with tolerance. Unlike the Assyrians, who relied on terror, Cyrus allowed conquered peoples to keep their customs and religions. His successors, Darius I and Xerxes I, expanded Persia even further. The Persian military was massive, with soldiers drawn from across the empire: Persians, Medes, Egyptians, Babylonians, and more. They created the legendary Immortals, an elite force of 10,000 soldiers who were always kept at full strength. If one died, another replaced him immediately, creating the illusion that they could never be diminished. The Persians would face their greatest challenge from a small but fierce people across the Aegean Sea. The Greeks, Greece, the birthplace of strategy. In Greece, Warfare was a way of life. The rugged geography of the land produced independent city-states like Athens and Sparta, each with its own army and style of fighting. The Persian invasions of Greece led to some of the most legendary battles in history. In 490 BCE, at the Battle of Marathon, a vastly outnumbered Athenian army defeated the Persians through superior tactics. The story goes that a messenger named Phidippides ran from Marathon to Athens, nearly 26 miles, to deliver news of victory, inspiring the modern marathon race. 10 years later, in 480 BCE, King Xerxes of Persia returned with an army said to number over 1 million, though historians believe it was smaller. At the narrow pass of Thermopylae, a tiny Greek force led by King Leonidas of Sparta made a legendary stand. With only 300 Spartans and a few thousand allies, they held off the Persian army for days, inflicting heavy losses. Though the Greeks were eventually overwhelmed, their courage became immortalized as a symbol of sacrifice and resistance. Later, at the Battle of Salamis, the Greeks struck back. Using their naval skills, they lured the massive Persian fleet into narrow straits, where their smaller, more maneuverable ships crushed the enemy. Persia's dream of conquering Greece was shattered, but the Greeks did not remain united. Soon after, Athens and Sparta turned on each other in the devastating Peloponnesian War 431 to 404 BCE. For nearly 3 decades, Greek fought Greek in a struggle for dominance. Sparta's disciplined warriors eventually triumphed, but at a cost. Greece was left weakened, vulnerable to a new rising power in the West. Rome, early Rome, from city to powerhouse. Rome began as a small city-state on the Italian peninsula, but even in its earliest days, war was its lifeblood. The Romans fought their neighbors, the Etruscans, Samnites, and Gauls, slowly expanding their territory. Unlike other peoples, the Romans were relentless. When defeated, they rebuilt. When conquered, they adapted. One key to Rome's success was its unique military system. Roman soldiers or legionaries were not just part-time warriors but trained professionals. The Roman legion, with its flexible formations and strict discipline, was one of the most effective fighting forces in the ancient world. By the 3rd century BCE, Rome had become a regional power, but a new enemy loomed across the Mediterranean: Carthage, a wealthy North African city with a powerful navy. The clash between Rome and Carthage would spark the Punic Wars, some of the most famous conflicts in ancient history. From the deserts of Egypt to the mountains of Greece, ancient civilizations turned war into both science and art, but none would take it further than Rome and Carthage. Their struggle would unleash battles so fierce and generals so brilliant that the entire Mediterranean would tremble. The Age of Empires was about to begin. 2 titans facing off across the Mediterranean Sea. One, a rising republic built on discipline and iron legions. The other, a wealthy naval empire whose merchants ruled the waves. Their rivalry would spark some of the bloodiest wars in history, unleash one of the greatest generals the world has ever known, and decide who would rule the ancient world. This is the clash of Rome and Carthage. By the 3rd century BCE, Rome had transformed from a small city-state into a dominant power on the Italian peninsula. Its military machine, the Roman legion, was unmatched in discipline and organization. But across the sea in North Africa, another power thrived. Carthage, located in modern-day Tunisia, was founded by Phoenician traders and grew into a wealthy empire. Unlike Rome, Carthage's strength was not its land armies but its navy. Its ships controlled Mediterranean trade routes, and its wealth made it a formidable rival. Inevitably, these 2 powers collided in what became known as the Punic Wars, 3 epic conflicts that would decide the fate of the ancient world. The First Punic War, 264 to 241 BC. The spark came from Sicily, a fertile island strategically placed between Italy and Africa. Rome feared Carthaginian expansion there, and Carthage feared Roman influence. What began as a dispute over a local Sicilian city soon spiraled into a full-scale war. The Romans were inexperienced at sea, but they adapted quickly. They built fleets modeled after captured Carthaginian ships and invented the corvus, a boarding device that turned naval battles into land battles. Rome's specialty. After more than 20 years of grinding conflict, Rome emerged victorious. Carthage was forced to surrender Sicily and pay heavy reparations, but Carthage was not finished. From its colonies in Spain, it rebuilt its strength, and from Spain rose a general whose name still echoes through history, Hannibal Barca. The Second Punic War 218 to 201 BCE. Hannibal was a master of strategy and daring. In 218 BCE, he launched one of the most audacious military campaigns ever attempted. Instead of sailing to Italy, he led his army, including war elephants, across the Alps. The journey was brutal. Thousands of men and animals perished in the freezing mountains. Yet when Hannibal descended into Italy, he brought terror with him. For over a decade, Hannibal devastated Roman armies on their own soil. At the Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE, he delivered one of the greatest tactical victories in military history, using a double envelopment maneuver. He surrounded a Roman army of nearly 80,000 men with his smaller force. By the end of the day, an estimated 50,000 Romans lay dead, a slaughter that haunted Rome for generations. Despite these victories, Hannibal faced one problem. Carthage never sent enough reinforcements. Rome, battered but unbroken, adapted. The Roman general Scipio Africanus struck back by taking the war to Carthage's homeland in 202 BCE. At the Battle of Zama, Scipio defeated Hannibal. Carthage lost its empire, its navy, and much of its independence. Rome had become the undisputed master of the Western Mediterranean. The Third Punic War 149 to 146 BC. Carthage was weakened but still alive. Rome, suspicious and unforgiving, eventually demanded Carthage be destroyed. When Carthage resisted, Rome unleashed total war. The siege lasted 3 years. In 146 BCE, Roman legions stormed the city. Carthage was burned to the ground, its people enslaved, and its land cursed. According to legend, the Romans even scattered salt so nothing would grow again. The destruction of Carthage sent a clear message. Rome was now the supreme power of the Mediterranean. Rome's expansion across the Mediterranean with Carthage gone, Rome turned eastward. They fought the Macedonian Wars against the descendants of Alexander the Great, conquering Greece and bringing it into their orbit. They clashed with kingdoms in Asia Minor, Egypt, and beyond. By the 1st century BCE, Rome had transformed from a republic into a sprawling empire that stretched from Spain to the Middle East. But Rome's victories came at a cost. Endless wars strained the republic's political system. Generals like Julius Caesar gained immense power, often putting their loyalty to themselves above the Senate. Caesar's conquest of Gaul showcased the might of the Roman army, but it also sparked civil war. His assassination in 44 BCE only deepened the chaos. From this turmoil rose Rome's first emperor, Augustus, who established the Pax Romana, a period of relative peace across the empire. But that peace was maintained by constant wars on the frontiers against Germanic tribes, Parthians, and others who challenged Rome's dominance. Rome's military machine. What made Rome so effective in war? Discipline and adaptation. Roman legions were organized into cohorts and centuries, with strict hierarchies and training. Soldiers built roads, forts, and siege engines, ensuring they could fight in any terrain. Rome absorbed the best ideas from its enemies, Greek phalanxes, Carthaginian naval tactics, and barbarian cavalry, and improved them for centuries. The Roman war machine seemed unstoppable, but no empire lasts forever. By the 4th and 5th centuries CE, Rome was strained by internal corruption, economic troubles, and relentless attacks from outside. The once mighty empire began to crumble. In 476 CE, the Western Roman Empire officially fell when the last emperor was deposed. But Rome's military legacy, its strategies, technologies, and conquests, would shape warfare for centuries. Rome had destroyed Carthage, conquered Greece, and built the greatest empire the ancient world had ever seen. But as Rome fell, a new chapter of warfare began. One of knights, castles, crusades, and an unstoppable force sweeping from the east. The Mongols. The Middle Ages were about to unleash wars unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. Imagine a world of towering castles, armored knights, and holy wars fought in the name of God. And then, out of the east, a thunderous storm of horsemen who would carve the largest empire the world has ever known. From crusaders in shining armor to the terrifying charge of Genghis Khan's cavalry, the Middle Ages were an age of endless conflict and unimaginable transformation. The medieval battlefield, after the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE, Europe descended into centuries often called the Dark Ages. Kingdoms rose and fell, and without Rome's unifying power, war became constant. Lords and kings relied on armored knights and stone castles to defend their lands. The feudal system tied peasants to lords, and in exchange for land and protection, knights pledged military service. Warfare in this era was brutal, often involving sieges that could last for months. Castles, with moats and towering walls, became symbols of both defense and domination. But the wars of the Middle Ages were not just about land, they were also about faith. The Crusades 1096 to 1291. In 1095, Pope Urban II called upon Christian knights to take up the cross and liberate Jerusalem from Muslim control. What followed were the Crusades, a series of religious wars that spanned nearly 2 centuries. The First Crusade shocked the world. Thousands of knights and peasants marched eastward, enduring starvation and disease. Against all odds, they captured Jerusalem in 1099, slaughtering its inhabitants in a wave of religious zeal. Over the years, more crusades followed. The most famous was the Third Crusade, 1189 to 1192, where Europe's greatest monarchs, Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick Barbarossa of Germany faced off against the brilliant Muslim leader Salahuddin Ayyubi. Though Richard proved a fierce warrior, Saladin recaptured Jerusalem and earned a reputation as both a skilled general and a noble enemy. In the end, the Crusades failed to secure permanent Christian control of the Holy Land, but they left deep scars and centuries of mistrust between East and West. The 100 Years' War, 1337 to 1453. Another defining conflict of the Middle Ages was the 100 Years' War between England and France. Despite its name, this war stretched over 116 years, marked by shifting alliances, legendary battles, and the rise of new technologies. Knights in heavy armor once dominated the battlefield, but in battles like Saint-Malo and Agincourt 1415, the English longbow changed everything. With devastating range and power, archers cut down waves of mounted knights, signaling the decline of chivalric warfare. The war also gave birth to legends. Joan of Arc, a teenage peasant girl claiming divine visions, inspired the French to rally. Leading armies into battle, she turned the tide before being captured and executed by the English. Her courage, however, became a symbol of resistance and faith. By the end of the war, France had expelled the English from most of its lands, and Europe stood at the dawn of a new era. But while Europe fought its own struggles, a far greater storm was brewing in the east. The rise of the Mongols, 13th century, far from Europe, across the vast steppes of Central Asia. A boy named Temujin was born in 1162, abandoned, hunted and hardened by survival. Temujin rose from nothing to unite the fractured Mongol tribes under one banner, taking the name Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler. He forged the most fearsome military machine the world had ever seen. The Mongol way of war was revolutionary. Unlike the armored knights of Europe, Mongol warriors were light cavalry, fast and deadly. They rode small but resilient horses, carried powerful composite bows, and could fire arrows accurately at full gallop. Their discipline was unmatched. Entire armies moved as one, striking with lightning speed and vanishing before enemies could respond. But the Mongols were not just skilled riders. They were masters of psychological warfare. Villages that resisted were annihilated, their destruction serving as a warning to others. Word of Mongol brutality spread faster than their armies, causing entire cities to surrender without a fight. Mongol conquests, a world on fire between 1206 and 1227. Genghis Khan's armies swept across Asia. They crushed the mighty Khwarezmian Empire, devastated Persia, and stormed into China, capturing Beijing, Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to ashes. After Genghis Khan's death in 1227, his sons and grandsons carried the empire even further. Under Genghis Khan, the Mongols invaded Russia and Eastern Europe. In 1241, they defeated European knights at the Battle of Legnica in Poland and at Mohi in Hungary. Europe trembled, fearing the Mongols would push all the way to the Atlantic, but Geday's sudden death forced them to retreat. Meanwhile, in Asia, Genghis's grandson Kublai Khan completed the conquest of China, founding the Yuan dynasty. At its height, the Mongol Empire stretched from Korea to Eastern Europe, from Siberia to the Middle East, the largest contiguous empire in history. Legacy of the Mongols reshaped warfare forever. They introduced new siege technologies, like massive catapults and gunpowder weapons. They revolutionized communication with relay stations that allowed messages to cross thousands of miles in days. But their empire was not only destruction. The Pax Mongolica Mongol peace allowed trade to flourish along the Silk Road. Merchants, scholars and travelers like Marco Polo moved freely across their empire, spreading ideas, inventions and cultures. Still, the Mongols' conquests left devastation in their wake. Tens of millions perished. Entire civilizations were shattered. And yet, in the ashes, new powers like the Ottoman Empire would soon rise. The Middle Ages had seen crusaders march to Jerusalem, knights fall before English arrows, and the Mongol horde carved the largest empire the world had ever known. But as the Mongols faded, a new empire would emerge from Anatolia, one that would dominate 3 continents for centuries. The world was about to meet the Ottomans. From a small band of warriors on the edge of collapse, they would rise to dominate 3 continents. With their cannons thundering, their cavalry charging, and their crescent banner flying high, the Ottomans weren't just conquerors. They were architects of an empire that terrified Europe and reshaped history for over 600 years. This is the story of the Ottoman war machine. Humble beginnings, 13th to 14th century. The story of the Ottomans begins in the late 13th century, in the shadow of the crumbling Seljuk Sultanate of Rum and the declining Byzantine Empire. A small group of Turkish nomadic warriors, led by Osman I, carved out a principality in northwestern Anatolia. Osman's descendants gave the dynasty its name, Ottomans Osmanogulari. At first, they were just one among many Turkish beyliks, but they possessed 2 advantages: location, right at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, and military skill. Fierce horsemen trained in the traditions of the steppe, combined with Islamic zeal. By the mid-14th century, the Ottomans were crossing into Europe. Using Ghazi warriors, holy warriors of Islam, they steadily expanded their frontiers. Expansion into Europe. One of the Ottomans' early great victories came in 1389 at the Battle of Kosovo. Facing a coalition of Serbian and Balkan forces, the Ottomans crushed their enemies despite heavy casualties. This battle cemented Ottoman dominance in the Balkans. Another decisive clash came at the Battle of Nicopolis 1396, where Sultan Bayezid I defeated a massive crusader army of Hungarians, French knights, and others. The Ottomans had now proven that even Europe's combined might could not easily stop them. But Bayezid's ambitions soon collided with another unstoppable force, Tamerlane Timur the Lame. In 1402, at the Battle of Ankara, the Ottomans suffered a catastrophic defeat at Timur's hands. Sultan Bayezid was captured, and the empire nearly disintegrated. Yet, unlike many states before them, the Ottomans recovered. By the mid-15th century, under the leadership of Mehmed II, they would unleash their full power. The fall of Constantinople 1453. For centuries, the Byzantine Empire had stood as a remnant of Rome. Its capital, Constantinople, was a jewel of the ancient world, fortified by the mighty Theodosian walls, which had repelled countless sieges. But in 1453, 21-year-old Mehmed II, Mehmed the Conqueror, set his sights on the city. With an army of around 80,000 men and, most importantly, massive gunpowder cannons, he began the siege. The most famous of these cannons was the Basilica, built by Hungarian engineer Orban. It could hurl stone balls weighing over half a ton against the walls. For weeks, Constantinople endured bombardment, until finally, on May 29, 1453, the Ottomans breached the walls. The city fell. Emperor Constantine XI died fighting, and the Byzantine Empire ceased to exist. Constantinople was renamed Istanbul, and it became the glorious capital of the Ottoman Empire. This victory shocked Europe. The last bastion of Rome had fallen, and a new Islamic superpower had risen, the Ottoman war machine. The Ottoman success came not just from bravery but from innovation. Janissaries' elite infantry recruited through the Devshirme system, where Christian boys were taken, converted to Islam and trained as professional soldiers loyal only to the Sultan. Armed with muskets and cannons, they became one of the first standing armies in Europe. Sipahi cavalry, the Ottoman feudal cavalry, given land in exchange for military service. Gunpowder. The Ottomans were among the earliest and most effective users of cannons and firearms, giving them a massive edge over traditional medieval armies. Navy. The Ottomans also built a powerful fleet that dominated the Mediterranean. This combination allowed them to expand at a staggering pace. Expansion across 3 continents into the Middle East. In 1517, under Selim I, the Ottomans defeated the powerful Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. This victory brought Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem under Ottoman control, making the Sultan also the Caliph of Islam. Into North Africa, the Ottomans expanded into Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya, controlling the southern Mediterranean and clashing with Spain. Into Eastern Europe, they marched into Hungary and besieged Vienna in 1529 under Suleiman the Magnificent. Though they failed to capture the city, it showed that even the heart of Europe was not safe. Suleiman the Magnificent 1522–1566. Perhaps the greatest Ottoman ruler was Suleiman I, known in the West as the Magnificent, and in the East as the Lawgiver. Suleiman expanded the empire to its greatest extent. He defeated Hungary at the Battle of Yiwu-Arlil, wiping out its army. He pushed deep into Central Europe, threatening the Habsburgs. In the Middle East, he waged war against the Safavid Persians, securing Mesopotamia, modern Iraq. At sea, his admirals like Barbarossa crushed European fleets, making the Mediterranean an Ottoman lake. Under Suleiman, the empire became not only a military powerhouse but also a cultural and legal giant. His reign marked the golden age of the Ottoman Empire. Wars with Europe. The Ottomans became the nightmare of Christian Europe. Their attempts to conquer Vienna in 1529 and again in 1683 were legendary sieges that defined European resistance. In 1571, at the Battle of Lepanto, a coalition of Christian states finally dealt the Ottomans a naval defeat, proving they were not invincible. But the empire still remained a giant, stretching from Hungary to Yemen, from Algeria to Baghdad. The decline begins. By the 17th century, however, cracks began to appear. The empire had grown vast and difficult to govern. Corruption weakened the Janissaries, and technological advances in Europe began to outpace the Ottomans. Still, the Ottomans fought fiercely. In 1683, at the Second Siege of Vienna, the empire once again attempted to capture the Austrian capital, but this time a massive Christian army led by the Polish king Jan Sobieski defeated them. This battle marked the beginning of Ottoman retreat in Europe. Over the next centuries, the Ottomans would slowly lose ground. Yet, for nearly 600 years, they had been one of the most powerful empires in history, shaping the destiny of continents. The Ottomans had risen from obscurity to conquer empires and rule half the known world. But while they battled for dominance in the West, a storm was brewing in the East. A conqueror was about to rise, a man whose empire would stretch across Asia. The legendary Mughal Empire of India. In the dusty plains of Central Asia, a warrior with bloodlines from both Genghis Khan and Timur, the Lame was destined to carve out a new empire. He marched into India with just 12,000 men, and crushed an army 10 times larger. This was no ordinary conqueror. This was the beginning of the mighty Mughal Empire, whose battles, emperors, and intrigues would shape the history of South Asia for over 300 years. The Mughal story begins with Zahiruddin Muhammad Boba, born in 1483 in the Fergana Valley, modern Uzbekistan. Baba was a descendant of both Timur on his father's side and Genghis Khan on his mother's side. Though he inherited a small kingdom, he dreamed of greater glory. After failed attempts to hold Samarkand, Babur looked southward. India with its wealth and fertile lands became his target. In 1526, at the Battle of Panipat, Babur faced the powerful Sultan of Delhi, Ibrahim Lodi. The result, a decisive Mughal victory. Ibrahim Lodi was killed, his massive army scattered, and Babur became the master of Delhi. The Mughal Empire had begun. Consolidation in Humayun's struggles. Babur's reign was short. He died in 1530, leaving his son Humayun to rule. But Humayun faced rebellion, internal betrayal, and invasions. In 1540, he was defeated by Sher Shah Suri, an Afghan general who briefly ousted the Mughals. For 15 years, the Mughal dream seemed lost, but destiny favored the dynasty. With Persian support, Humayun reclaimed Delhi in 1555, only to die a year later in an accident. His son Akbar then took the throne, and everything changed. Akbar the Great 1556 to 1605. Jalaluddin Muhammad Akbar, one of history's greatest emperors, inherited the throne at just 13 years old. Immediately, he faced danger. In 1556, at the Second Battle of Panipat, the Mughals faced Hemu, a brilliant Hindu general who nearly crushed them. But Akbar's regent, Bairam Khan, led the Mughal forces to victory. The empire was saved, and Akbar would soon prove himself a master of war and diplomacy. Akbar's wars of expansion. He conquered Rajputana, forging alliances with Hindu Rajput rulers by both force and diplomacy. Many Rajputs became loyal allies, strengthening the Mughal state. He subdued Gujarat, Bengal, and Kashmir, bringing prosperity to the empire. He pushed into Deccan India, though resistance remained fierce. But Akbar was more than a conqueror. He built a system of governance that balanced military might with tolerance. He abolished the jizya tax on non-Muslims, married Rajput princesses, and promoted a culture of inclusion. Under him, the Mughal Empire became the most powerful state in South Asia, wealthy, diverse, and militarily unstoppable. Jahangir and Shah Jahan 1605 to 1658. Akbar's son Jahangir continued the empire's expansion, but is remembered more for his love of art and wine than for war. Still, he faced rebellions and fought campaigns against Afghan tribes and Rajput princes. His son Shah Jahan is most famous for building the Taj Mahal, but he too waged wars. He expanded Mughal influence in the Deccan. He fought against Persians who seized Kandahar, a crucial frontier city, but the endless wars drained resources, setting the stage for both greatness and decline. Aurangzeb, the last great Mughal 1658 to 1707. Few rulers in history are as controversial as Aurangzeb Alamgir. Unlike Akbar's tolerance, Aurangzeb enforced stricter Islamic policies. Yet, as a general, he was unmatched. For nearly 50 years, he waged wars across the subcontinent. Against the Deccan Sultanates, he finally conquered Bijapur and Golconda. Against the Marathas led by the legendary warrior Shivaji, the Marathas resisted Mughal expansion. Even after Shivaji's death, the Marathas waged guerrilla warfare that drained Aurangzeb's strength. Against the Sikhs, the rise of Sikh militarization under Guru Gobind Singh turned Punjab into a battlefield. Aurangzeb expanded the empire to its greatest territorial extent, stretching from Afghanistan to almost the southern tip of India. But his endless wars left the empire bankrupt and overextended. The beginning of decline 18th century. After Aurangzeb's death in 1707, the Mughal Empire fractured. His successors were weak, more interested in palace intrigues than battlefields. Enemies who had once feared the Mughals now rose against them. The Marathas pushed north, defeating Mughal armies repeatedly. The Sikhs carved out their own powerful state in Punjab. Nader Shah of Persia invaded Delhi in 1739, massacred thousands, and looted treasures like the Peacock Throne. Ahmad Shah Durrani Abdoli, founder of Afghanistan, launched multiple invasions, including the Third Battle of Panipat 1761, one of the bloodiest battles in history, fought between the Afghans and the Marathas, with the declining Mughals caught in between. By the late 18th century, the once mighty Mughals were little more than figureheads in Delhi. Real power shifted to regional powers and, soon, European colonizers. The Mughal military legacy is vast. They brought gunpowder warfare to the forefront of South Asia. They blended Central Asian cavalry traditions with Indian elephant warfare and artillery. Their wars created both unity and division across India, leaving a lasting cultural impact. The empire that began with Babur's daring gamble in 1526 had shaped centuries of Indian history. The Mughal Empire had risen in fire and steel, blazing across India like a storm. But as their sun began to set, a new kind of warfare was about to dominate the world. Battles not just of swords and cannons, but of colonies, oceans, and empires. The age of European imperial wars was about to begin. Imagine the world on fire, trenches stretching for miles, skies filled with roaring warplanes, and cities reduced to ashes by bombs. In the 20th century, humanity waged not one but two wars so massive and brutal that they would forever change the way nations fought, ruled, and lived. This is the story of the World Wars, the deadliest chapters in human history, the road to World War I, 1914. The world of the early 20th century was a powder keg. European empires had grown greedy, competing for colonies in Africa and Asia. Nationalism was rising, with smaller nations demanding independence. Alliances were formed, the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy, and the Triple Entente, Britain, France, Russia. One spark set it all off: the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary in Sarajevo, June 1914. Within weeks, a web of alliances dragged the entire continent into war. World War I, 1914 to 1918. The war quickly turned into a nightmare. Trench warfare. From the North Sea to Switzerland, millions of soldiers dug in. Life in the trenches meant mud, rats, disease, and constant shelling. New weapons, machine guns, tanks, poison gas, flamethrowers, and airplanes transformed battlefields into killing fields. Battle of the Somme, 1916. Over 1 million casualties in just 5 months. Battle of Verdun, 1916. They shall not pass, became the French cry, as both sides lost hundreds of thousands. The war wasn't just in Europe. Fighting spread to Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. The Ottoman Empire, allied with Germany, fought against British-backed Arab rebels, giving rise to the famous story of Lawrence of Arabia. By 1917, the US entered the war after German submarine attacks sank American ships. This tipped the balance. Finally, in 1918, exhausted Germany surrendered. The aftermath of WWI, the cost was staggering. Over 16 million dead and 21 million wounded. The Treaty of Versailles, 1919, punished Germany with massive reparations, loss of territory, and humiliation. But instead of peace, the treaty planted seeds of resentment and revenge. Germany was broken, but not for long. Everyone thought the Great War was the war to end all wars. But just 2 decades later, the world would be dragged into an even darker, more destructive conflict. A man named Adolf Hitler was about to set Europe and the world ablaze. The rise of fascism in the 1930s saw the rise of dangerous leaders. Adolf Hitler in Germany, promising revenge and a new empire. Benito Mussolini in Italy, dreaming of Roman glory. Imperial Japan, expanding across Asia with ruthless militarism. Economic collapse from the Great Depression fueled their rise. Democracies hesitated, appeasing dictators rather than confronting them. World War II, 1939 to 1945. The storm broke in 1939 when Hitler invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war. Early German Blitzkrieg. Germany unleashed Blitzkrieg lightning war, fast-moving tanks, mechanized infantry, and bombers. France collapsed in 1940. Britain stood alone, fighting the Battle of Britain, where RAF pilots defended the skies against relentless German Luftwaffe attacks. War expands globally. In 1941, Germany made his greatest mistake, invading the Soviet Union. The Eastern Front became the bloodiest theater of war. Meanwhile, in Asia, Japan struck Pearl Harbor in December 1941, pulling the United States fully into the war. Battle of Stalingrad, 1942-43. Brutal street-to-street combat. The Soviets surrounded and defeated the German Sixth Army. Hitler's advance east was broken. Battle of El Alamein, 1942. In North Africa, British General Montgomery stopped Rommel's Desert Fox forces. D-Day, June 6, 1944, Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, beginning the liberation of Western Europe. In the Pacific, the US adopted an island-hopping strategy, seizing territories closer and closer to Japan. Battles like Midway and Iwo Jima turned the tide. In 1945, the Soviets stormed Berlin. Germany surrendered in May. Against Japan, the US dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August. Japan surrendered soon after. World War II was finally over. The destruction was unprecedented. Over 70 million dead worldwide. Cities like Warsaw, Hiroshima, and Berlin lay in ruins. 2 superpowers emerged, the United States and the Soviet Union. Beginning the Cold War, the United Nations was created in 1945, aiming to prevent future global wars. The world wars had shown humanity both its greatest courage and its darkest cruelty. But peace was fragile. The world was now divided, East versus West, capitalism versus communism, and the wars that followed would not always be fought with armies across open battlefields, but with spies, missiles, and shadows. The Cold War was about to begin. 2 superpowers with enough nuclear weapons to destroy the planet, staring each other down for nearly half a century. The Cold War was not fought with open battles between armies, but with spies, propaganda, proxy wars, and a terrifying nuclear shadow hanging over the entire world. This is the story of the Cold War, a war of nerves, ideologies, and survival. The birth of the Cold War, 1945 to 1949. World War II had ended, but peace didn't last long. The United States emerged as the leader of the capitalist, democratic world. The Soviet Union rose as the champion of communism, spreading influence across Eastern Europe. Winston Churchill famously said in 1946, "An iron curtain has descended across the continent." The world split in 2. NATO North Atlantic Treaty Organization, 1949 united the West. The Warsaw Pact, 1955 brought the Soviet bloc together. It was no longer about land, it was about ideology. A nuclear shadow, both superpowers raced to build nuclear weapons. The US had dropped the atomic bomb in 1945. By 1949, the Soviets tested their own. Soon after, both developed the hydrogen bomb, thousands of times more powerful. This led to the doctrine of mad, mutually assured destruction. If either side launched nukes, the other would retaliate, destroying the world. The result, constant tension. One mistake could end humanity. Spies, propaganda, and psychological war. The Cold War wasn't just military. It was fought in every way possible. CIA versus KGB. Espionage became a powerful weapon. Double agents, secret missions, and assassinations were daily tools. Space race. The Soviets launched Sputnik 1957, the first satellite. The US responded by putting a man on the moon in 1969. Space became a symbol of superiority. Propaganda, films, radio, posters, and media. Each side painted the other as evil. Even sports became a battlefield, with Olympic Games symbolizing the clash of ideologies. Proxy wars. Fighting without fighting directly. The US and USSR avoided direct conflict, but fought indirectly through other nations. The Korean War in 1950 to 1953. North Korea, backed by the USSR, and China invaded South Korea, backed by the US and UN. The war devastated the peninsula and ended in a stalemate, creating the 38th parallel, which still divides Korea today. The Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975. A brutal guerrilla war between Communist North Vietnam, supported by the USSR and China, and South Vietnam, supported by the US. The US lost over 58,000 soldiers. Millions of Vietnamese died. In 1975, Saigon fell, and Vietnam became communist. Afghanistan, 1979 to 1989. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan to support a communist government. The US armed the Mujahideen rebels, including figures who would later shape global terrorism. The Soviets faced a humiliating defeat, often called the USSR's Vietnam. flashpoints that almost ended the world. Berlin blockade, 1948. The Soviets cut off West Berlin. The US responded with the Berlin airlift, flying supplies into the city for a year. Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962. The Soviets placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the US after 13 tense days. Both sides pulled back. The world came closer to nuclear war than ever before. Berlin Wall, 1961 to 1989. The wall became the ultimate symbol of division, separating East from West, communism from capitalism. The Cold War thaws and heats again. By the 1970s, the two sides, USA and USSR, experimented with easing tensions. Treaties like SALT, Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, slowed the arms race, but the invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 reignited tensions. The US boycotted the 1980 Olympics in Moscow. The Soviets boycotted the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. By 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. The Cold War was over. Wars between India and Pakistan, two nations born from the same land, yet divided by destiny. For over 7 decades, India and Pakistan have clashed again and again in mountains, in deserts, across seas, and even in the digital battlefield. From the first shots fired in 1948 to the frozen peaks of Kargil in 1999, and even whispers of a future war in 2025. The story of these wars is the story of a rivalry that shaped South Asia. This is the history of the India-Pakistan Wars. The First Kashmir War, 1947 to 1948. The moment India and Pakistan were born in 1947, partition unleashed a storm of violence. Amidst this chaos, the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir became the spark of the First War. Tribal militias from Pakistan, backed by the army, entered Kashmir. The Maharaja, desperate for survival, acceded to India, bringing Indian troops into the valley. For more than a year, battles raged in the snowy mountains and deep valleys. Soldiers fought hand to hand, often without proper equipment, against the biting Himalayan cold. By the time the UN called for a ceasefire in 1949, Kashmir was divided, but the question of who truly owned it remained unanswered. It was the beginning of a conflict that would define generations. And it was far from over. The War of 1965. 17 years later, Kashmir once again set the stage for war. In 1965, Operation Gibraltar sent Pakistani troops disguised as locals into Indian territory, sparking a fierce response. What followed was one of the largest tank battles since World War II. In the plains of Punjab, Indian and Pakistani tanks clashed under fire while fighter jets turned the skies into battlegrounds. Cities echoed with air raid sirens. Soldiers charged across fields where every inch of land was soaked in blood. The war ended in a stalemate, with both nations claiming victory. But one thing was clear: the rivalry had only deepened. Both sides knew the next war would be even larger and deadlier. The 1971 War, birth of Bangladesh. If the wars of 1948 and 1965 were about Kashmir, the War of 1971 was about identity. In East Pakistan, resentment had been growing for years. When civil war broke out, millions of refugees fled into India. India intervened, launching a full-scale assault on both eastern and western fronts. In just 13 days, the Indian army surrounded Dhaka. The Pakistani army, overwhelmed and cut off, surrendered. A new nation was born, Bangladesh. It was one of the shortest yet most decisive wars of the 20th century for Pakistan. It was a devastating loss. For India, it was a historic victory. But for the people of the subcontinent, it was another reminder that wars leave scars that never fade. The Kargil War, 1999. 28 years later, war returned to the mountains. In 1999, Pakistani soldiers and militants secretly occupied high-altitude positions on the Indian side of the line of control in Kargil. What followed was a brutal conflict fought on the world's highest battlefield. Indian soldiers climbed steep icy cliffs under relentless enemy fire. Artillery shook the mountains, while jets bombed hidden bunkers among the rocks. Every inch of land cost dozens of lives. By July, India recaptured the peaks, Pakistan withdrew, but the Kargil War had shown the world just how fragile peace in South Asia really was. Yet, even after this, the fire of conflict never died down, it only smoldered, waiting for the next spark. Imagine a battlefield where your enemy has no uniform, no flag, and no borders, where wars are fought with drones instead of tanks, and where a single keystroke can cripple a nation more effectively than an army. This is modern warfare, unpredictable, invisible, and perhaps the most dangerous era of conflict humanity has ever seen. A new world after the Cold War. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the US stood as the world's only superpower. For a brief moment, many believed that the end of history had arrived, that peace and democracy would spread across the world. But peace didn't last. Instead, a new enemy emerged, not a country but an ideology: terrorism. The War on Terror. 2001 present. The 9/11 attacks. 2001. On September 11, 2001, the United States was struck by the deadliest terrorist attack in history. Al-Qaeda terrorists hijacked passenger planes, destroying the Twin Towers in New York and hitting the Pentagon. Nearly 3,000 people were killed. This event changed global security forever. It was no longer about armies clashing. Now, a handful of extremists could bring a superpower to its knees. The US invasion of Afghanistan. 2001. The Taliban, who ruled Afghanistan, had sheltered Al-Qaeda's leader Osama bin Laden in October 2001. The US and NATO launched a massive invasion. The Taliban government was toppled within weeks, but the war dragged on for 20 years, making it the longest US war in history. The Iraq War. 2003. The US accused Saddam Hussein of possessing weapons of mass destruction. In 2003, the US invaded Iraq, quickly removing Saddam from power. But Iraq collapsed into chaos, with sectarian violence and the rise of terrorist groups. Rise of ISIS. 2014. From the ashes of Iraq and Syria emerged ISIS, Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. They declared a caliphate across large territories, ruling with brutality. Their propaganda spread globally, inspiring lone wolf attacks in Europe, Asia, and America. An international coalition fought back, eventually crushing ISIS's territory by 2019. The War on Terror reshaped the world. Surveillance expanded, airport security transformed, and countries lived under constant threat of extremist violence. The rise of technology in warfare. Modern wars are no longer fought only with guns and bombs. Technology has created entirely new battlefields. Drones and remote warfare. Drones are now used for surveillance and targeted strikes. They allow militaries to kill from thousands of miles away, but also raise moral questions about civilian casualties. Cyber warfare. Nations can now hack into each other's infrastructure. Power grids, financial systems, even elections can be attacked without firing a bullet. In 2010, the Stuxnet virus, allegedly created by the US and Israel, sabotaged Iran's nuclear program, showing the terrifying potential of cyber weapons. Artificial intelligence, AI in war. AI is now used to analyze data, predict enemy moves, and even control autonomous weapons. Some experts warn we may be entering an age of killer robots, raising ethical concerns about machines making life-or-death decisions. Regional conflicts and new front lines. Middle East wars. The Syrian civil war. 2011 present turned into a proxy war between the US, Russia, Iran, and Turkey. Millions have been displaced, and the conflict continues. Yemen's war. 2015 present became one of the world's worst humanitarian crises, with Saudi Arabia and Iran backing opposite sides. The Russia-Ukraine war. In 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the largest war in Europe since World War II. The conflict has reshaped global politics, bringing NATO closer together and sparking fears of a wider war. On April 22, 2025, a terrorist attack in Pahalgam, Indian-administered Kashmir, killed 26 civilians, mostly Hindu tourists. The group the Resistance Front, TRF, linked to Lashkar-e-Taiba, initially claimed responsibility but later denied involvement. India blamed Pakistan for harboring terrorist groups and launched Operation Sinjar on May 7, targeting terror infrastructure in Pakistan and Pakistan-administered Kashmir. Pakistan denied involvement in the attack and accused India of conducting unprovoked strikes on civilian areas, calling it a false flag operation. India launched missile and drone strikes on 9 sites, including alleged Let and Jaish-e-Mohammed GEM headquarters in Bahawalpur, Muridki and Muzaffarabad 1. Pakistan retaliated with artillery shelling in Jammu and Poonch. Aerial dogfights occurred, with Pakistan claiming to have shot down 6 Indian fighter jets, including Rafales, MiG-29, Mirage 2000, and Su-30 Mki. Both sides escalated with drone and missile attacks. India targeted radar and air defense systems in Pakistan. Pakistan responded by striking 26 Indian air bases. India reportedly used Israeli and indigenous drones, while Pakistan deployed Chinese and Turkish drones. Pakistan launched Operation Bunyan and Mahsoos, targeting Indian military bases. Pakistan launched a full-spectrum cyber and military offensive that caught India off guard. Pakistani cyber units, allegedly supported by elite foreign hackers, crippled India's national power grid, plunging major cities like Delhi, Mumbai, and Bangalore into darkness. This disruption paralyzed Indian communications and command structures for over 48 hours. In a bold airstrike, Pakistan targeted and destroyed India's Russian-made S-400 air defense system stationed near the western border. This marked a significant blow to India's aerial superiority. While India had named its offensive Operation Sinjar, the campaign quickly turned into a strategic failure. Pakistani forces not only repelled the attacks but also advanced into key sectors along the line of control, facing a decisive defeat and mounting internal pressure. President Trump, leveraging diplomatic and economic influence, requested Pakistan to cease hostilities. Pakistan agreed, but only after securing strategic and symbolic victories. Though not a formal surrender in military terms, India's acceptance of a ceasefire under pressure was seen by many analysts as a humiliating claim down. The Indian army faced global embarrassment, with media across the world questioning its preparedness and leadership. One thing I really want to say that from the first wars with spears and stones, to Genghis Khan's horsemen, to nuclear standoffs, humanity has always found ways to fight. But the modern era reveals something chilling. War no longer needs a battlefield. It can happen online. It can happen in the sky. It can happen inside the human mind through fear. And so, as we stand at the edge of the future, one question haunts us. Will technology finally end war, or will it give humanity the power to destroy itself completely? From ancient spears to artificial intelligence, the story of war has been the story of humanity itself. And the final chapter is still unwritten.